Day 1268 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzie here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So starting off, we'll take a look at those Russian losses, as currently Russia sits on more than 1,068,000 military personnel losses, representing an additional 940 in the past day. Then as for hardware, 2 tanks, 3 APVs, 40 artillery, a rocket launcher, and 1 aircraft, with reports of a Russian Sukhoi Su-30 multi-role fighter jet that crashed in the Black Sea. As Ukrainian naval intelligence reported, Syzran intercepted comms southeast of Sminy Island, which is Snake Island. Debris was found, crew were missing, with the jet likely coming from Crimea's 43rd Naval Attack Regiment. But that much is not confirmed, and no Russian statement, though aviation-adjacent blogger Fighter Bomber marked the loss in a post overnight. Details are still coming in on this incident, though Kyiv hints at a possible shoot-down. And then lastly, for the daily stats update, a whopping additional entry of another successful strike on a Russian oil refinery, making for 7 refineries clobbered over the past 13 days. It's unprecedented at this pace, and is almost certainly on Putin's Alaska summit agenda, with President Trump shortly today, and that is to say, a push for a ceasefire, or partial ceasefire, shielding Russian energy assets, effectively politically tying Ukraine's hands from carrying out such high-impact strikes. Now, as for this latest unshielded site, as Ukraine's long-range drones have once again pierced deep into Russia's energy heartland, this time hammering the Syzran oil refinery in the Samara Oblast, some 800 kilometers from the front. Local reports suggest as many as 10 UAVs targeted the sprawling complex overnight, triggering multiple explosions and at least 2 major fires that burned well into the morning, becoming the 4th successful hit on the refinery, but only the first for 2025, for a facility capable of producing up to 9 million tons of oil products a year. Video and eyewitness accounts show towering plumes of smoke and scattered blaze points across the site as emergency crews struggled to contain the damage. Ukraine clearly means business with these strikes. In fact, Moscow imposed a 6-month gasoline export ban for most varieties of fuel back in March of this year, and with just 2 weeks left on that clock, it suggests a necessitation for them to extend the ban even further, with the existing export bans already being a reluctant admission that the Ukrainian strikes are biting harder than the Kremlin would like to admit. What a strategic liability these sites have become for Russia. Then to head west on the map, a massive blast tore through the elastic gunpowder plant in Russia's Ryazan region, wiping out powder workshops and shattering buildings in the Shilovo district. Russian state media, citing early reports, said that safety violations in the workshop may be to blame, though officials haven't confirmed. Footage from the scene shows parts of the factory reduced to wreckage, and scattered debris and warped metal where the production line once stood. Authorities are now under pressure to explain how such an accident could hit one of the country's key munitions facilities in the middle of wartime production. Do note, there is currently no credible evidence or reporting to suggest a Ukrainian UAV involvement in this latest incident, at least so far, and where the possibility actually remains that it stemmed from poor safety practices, consistent with a broader pattern of past accidents. In fact, even before the start of the SMO, the very same site experienced similar industrial incidents as late as 2021. Then, as for protection measures for such regions, you just have to look to Moscow, quietly stitching a 200-kilometer belt of short-range air defenses around the capital. The color-coded sites seen here: blue confirmed, red likely, white under construction, orange to be determined sites. The Kremlin, and I mean that term in the most localized sense, as the Kremlin itself is directly centralized within the oblast and capital city, where the Kremlin may be seeking to protect itself and its strong defense narrative for the most populated region in the country, and at the expense of sufficient air defense installations outside of the capital. But a ring is only as strong as the radar, the crews, and interceptors that keep it alive, but Moscow's adversaries' aerial incursions are, for all practical purposes, self-replicating, fueled by Ukraine's drone production surge coming from its defense industrial base in 2025. And how things are shaping up now, it's a losing battle for Russian air defense. But where Russia's air defenses are absurdly overstocked is in Valdai, northwest of Moscow, at Putin's lakeside residence, which you could say has a ring of its own, with approximately 12 to 18 or more air defense systems protecting the location, and said to be 1/5 of what the capital has at its disposal, with S-400s and Pantsers deployed. As for those S-400s, we're talking full batteries, and not just single launchers. And so, with such heightened protective measures in this region, it all underscores the Kremlin leader's paranoia and determination to keep his personal nightly retreat as safe as possible. Now to the main map, and very briefly to Sumy, which somewhat ties into the Donetsk front, as Moscow's bid for a sanitary zone here failing to achieve desired results, with several mauled motorized rifle regiments and elements of the 106th Airborne that are reportedly now being reconstituted and redeployed south toward Pokrovsk to ratchet up the pressure. This follows a run of Ukrainian gains that shoved Russian forces back beyond the Kursk border and stabilized the front line right here. Though one might say it's a pity that the invaders weren't lulled into a false sense of security and more success in this region, which would have further denied them the opportunity to move some of their fighting elements into the southeastern front. Speaking of, now to that very region, as Ukrainian forces have struck an ammunition depot in occupied Yankiv, triggering powerful secondary blast. The location also serves as a HQ and barracks for the Russian 132nd Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade since 2015. Then to the main forward line of operations within Donetsk, as Ukrainian forces, with key support from the National Guard's 1st Azov Corps, have shown to stabilize the Russian push in the Dobropilla sector, and also, up to now, preventing further Russian gains towards Pokrovsk. Kyiv notes that Russian advances here remain limited, despite an intensive infantry effort. Moscow's approach has been to send smaller groups behind Ukrainian lines over time, establish ambush positions, and reinforce gradually. But anti-tank trenches have effectively stopped the passage of invader vehicles and motorcycles, where they have the luxury of expending such kit, leading to these smaller agile infantry units being the major category, previously managing to cross some of this terrain. As a result, Ukrainian reserves deployed at this critical stage have neutralized most Russian assault groups and are targeting reconnaissance and sabotage teams at the present stage. The situation now is steady but remains challenging. Ukrainian commanders expect Russia to test the lines again, possibly with a new strike force aimed at the rear of their defenses. However, we see Dobropilla, for instance, holding under Ukrainian control. In fact, the only real certified movement of the Russian forces over the past 24 hours was found on the more southern Tolstoy front, around the outskirts of this central village to the area, with some further consolidation by Russian forces up to, or near to, the Dnipro-Petrovsk border. Then also on the map, momentarily, to Kharkiv's north, where following a recent spat of activity, Ukrainian troops have seized back part of the Hoptivka checkpoint at the border, driving Russian forces from the southern sector in a brisk counterattack, and with clearing operations along the Russia-Ukraine border crossing that remain underway. And of it, this was actually reported as wildly good news from the AFU. Then headed to practically the other side of the map, where FPV drone strikes have pounded Russian personnel personnel positions on the Kinburn spit, hitting multiple fortified posts strung along the base of the narrow sandbar. There's only so many positions to occupy in this tight spit, with the Russian forces stationed there more than likely taking a pummeling not from Ukrainian military personnel stationed in Kherson, but instead from border defenses stationed inside of a wider Mykolaiv front, with as little as a 10-kilometer gap between invader and defender. Now to the news, where Anchorage is bracing for the most surreal diplomatic theater of the year. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov stepped off the plane in a sweatshirt emblazoned with USSR, or CCCP in Russian Cyrillic script. Not exactly subtle, and an oddly provocative choice for the foreign minister to wear on the eve of the Trump-Putin meeting, signaling Soviet-era expansionist nostalgia rather than the neutral professionalism expected of a nation's top diplomat. And that's just the thing, isn't it? Foreign ministers or secretaries of state all over the globe are almost universally regarded as the nation's top diplomat, thereby making Lavrov's choice of sweatshirt here all the more perplexing and unmistakably aggressive. As for the wider Anchorage scene, pro-Ukraine rallies have filled downtown streets with chants and banners that include Ukraine and Alaska, Russian never again, and you can hardly blame Alaskans, with countless examples of Russia's deep desire to one day hope to take back the territory. There's many examples here, but take for instance, after Russia invaded Crimea, they built this monument in the occupied peninsula with the following challenge to future generations, boldly claiming, "We have returned Crimea, you are to return Alaska," with the territories of both Crimea and Alaska engraved. How sickly sweet. Now, as for this upcoming 11:30 a.m. local time meeting between Putin and Trump in a closed-door personal setting, with only a translator, the official agenda is for that of a ceasefire and potential peace framework for the Russo-Ukrainian war. Behind closed doors, however, Kremlin objectives are broader, reframing the war narrative towards a US-Russia thaw, nudging Washington into bilateral arms control talks, and probing for economic relief as sanctions weigh on Russia's economy. Trump, flanked by Vice President J.D. Vance, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, have limited expectations of achieving verifiable results at this summit, with Trump himself asserting that he'll know within the first 5 minutes of the meeting with Putin whether it's a meeting that leads to peace or is going nowhere. If Trump does consider it a success, then it's shortly expected that a trilateral meeting that includes Zelensky would be one of the very next engagements. Now, for this meeting about to occur, most concerning perhaps is that Putin's entourage is reportedly carrying historical materials, maps aimed at arguing Ukraine is an artificial state, alongside additional Donetsk military maps to sway Trump into the position of a hopeless outcome for Ukraine. Let's only hope that he does not take the bait, but if he does, then that would go a long way to ensure that a truly blockbuster follow-up trilateral meeting would then be on the horizon, something very worthy of anticipation. However, for now, for this event, and follow-up a joint press conference activity expected between the US and Russian leader, the Kremlin has stated that Putin will present the agreements and understandings that may be reached between the two countries' leaders, which may comprise of Russia's persistent hallmark stance of Ukraine fully ceding all of the partially occupied regions in exchange for what would amount to a very temporary ceasefire. So imagine that, withdrawing your troops about 80 kilometers out of their most successfully defended positions, only to inevitably open the way for Russia to launch offensives towards Kharkiv, Poltava, Dnipro, and Kyiv not long after, and surely with the excuse that Ukraine has willingly broken a ceasefire. That'd just be a militarily daft masterclass in self-sabotage. Now, with still some time to go before the Trump-Putin meeting, plus however long that will take. Which means to round off the video, and let's take a look at how Putin's travelling so far, as he's landed at the joint base Elmendorf-Richardson, Anchorage, where the Trump-Putin meeting will also take place. Very isolated, all to the one safe location for Putin. Now, before landing, Putin, as expected, spent the night in Russia's Far East, visiting a plant in Magadan that produces omega-3 from whitefish, with all the EPA and DHA of those fatty acids, hoping to give himself a boost of mental clarity as he prepares to deliver a 3-hour discourse on historical nonsensicality. So that's it for today, guys. Thanks again for watching. Please continue to like, comment, subscribe if not already, and thanks once again for all of the support, and I do hope to see all of you guys there in the very next one. Cheers!